this section, we're going to deal with the process for finding